It will be a long time before the grief and mourning recedes after this month's downing of Flight 752 by the Iranian regime. That act killed 176 people, including 57 Canadians. Much more imminently, the international community, including Canada, needs to figure out the next steps in dealing with the Iranian Republic. With us now to share their expertise, Janice Stein, the Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management and founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the U of T. Political scientist Saeed Ranama, the now retired founding director of York University's School of Public Policy and Administration. Besma Momani, professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and a senior fellow at CG, the Center for International Governance Innovation. And Christian Leuprecht, the class of 1965 professor in leadership at the Royal Military College of Canada, also cross-appointed to Queen's University, both of them in Kingston, and we are happy to have all four of you here around our table tonight for, sadly, a timely and important conversation about one of the most dangerous places in the world today. Janice, to you first. We both know that President Bush, the son, President Obama, both had an opportunity to fire the shot that could have killed Soleimani, and they declined. Trump decided to do it. Why do you think it was important to take him out now, as President Trump clearly did?
I do not think that the explanation that President Trump has given everybody of imminent attack, which means an attack with a timeline, a plan, as opposed to some general chatter about future intention, I do not think his explanation is credible at all. And we have no intelligence source from the United States, and they are leaking right now, has actually confirmed in any meaningful sense that that was the real reason. So what was? Second, conspiratorial reason, I don't accept either. Distraction from impeachment.
You're not buying that?
I'm not buying that one at all. So why do this? And we're speculating now. Trump really, if you can find a thread in most of what he does, he's disruptive. When he's blocked and when he can't move forward, he disrupts in a completely unpredictable way. He breaks the egg and hopes that out of that he's going to be able to make an omelet. This was a really disruptive action throughout the whole region and a terrific challenge to the regime. Nobody could have predicted what would have happened in the subsequent 72 hours, but it shook everything up.
Christian, I gathered the president was presented with a series of options by his national security team, some of them less dramatic. He chose the one that was the most dramatic. Did he pick the right option?
Well, I think he's trying to get an end game for the Middle East. Look, he ran on a platform of getting deals with China, with North Korea, with Iran, and he hasn't accomplished any of that. And he also ran on a platform of bringing the troops home. And so given the stalemate that we've seen, this is a way, I think, of trying to force everybody back to the table and trying to get some sort of a deal. But I think it's also indicative of that the Middle East is becoming a sideshow for the United States. Look,
a sideshow?
2/3 of U.S. deployed assets are in the Asia-Pacific theater. The priority for the Americans is containment of China and China's action in that region. And so both the energy and the forces that are invested in the Middle East are distracting from that. And so I think this is also an effort for the U.S. to extract itself from the region. So to some extent, I think he doesn't mind being told that he needs to draw down his troops by some of the locals. And we already saw the calls also towards NATO member countries that they will need to step up and fill the gap.
Besma, given the options available to the president, presented to him by his national security team, did he pick the right one?
No. I mean, I should say that I'm not shedding a tear for the death of Soleimani. I mean, he was a terrible person and had lots of blood on his hands. But the reality is, and I think we're going to see this over time, it hasn't played out yet. You know, we have to really have a long view of history here, because the challenge is this will have unintended consequences throughout the region that I think are negative in the long run. It's not to say that, again, he was a person to be preserved or somehow protected. And to the point that I think was pointed out by Janice, is that he he's known about his whereabouts. Many within the National Security Council have said that they knew his whereabouts at least for 7 months. They've been tracking him. He's clearly been going through commercial airports, lots of reports, whether it's the New York Times and others, showing that he's been in the public and everybody knew where he was if you wanted to get him. So the question of why now is really the key point. I don't buy the imminent threat argument, as Janice said. It just doesn't make sense. So why now? And that's something that I think we're all trying to grapple with, because he is unpredictable and he tends to indeed choose options before him that not only are probably the least likely, and maybe actually takes a little thrill out of choosing the least likely option. In fact, some of the reports coming out, again, New York Times, is suggesting that, after that fact, the Pentagon folks started to say, okay, maybe we shouldn't give him every option on the table, because he'll choose the one that's the craziest of all the bunch. So we're all grappling with this. He's a very unorthodox person. But I do believe, and as Christian pointed out, I don't think the Americans want to increase their footprint in the Middle East. This is something that I think people don't get about this president. He is very sensitive to his base. When Ann Coulter and all the rest of the base, so to speak, start criticizing him for increasing his footprint in the Middle East, you can see right away he retracts. He is sensitive to that particular group. He's not a neocon. He doesn't want to expand the footprint in the Middle East. So he does these things that are frankly maybe perceived by military folks as surgical one-offs, but they're probably more problematic sometimes than increasing troop levels. So they're not without consequence. They're not neutral policy actions, even by understanding that he doesn't want to increase his footprint. I think the long run challenge is that actually he may rope in the Americans, and us included, because of the chaos he unleashes with these actions.
Saeed, do you have a view as to why Soleimani and why now?
Well, I cannot find any logic in an illogical foreign policy, an illogical president like Trump. But at the same time, what he did actually was the reverse of what he had intended. Because first of all, it gave lots of oxygen to a dying regime in Iran, which the public was confronting with him. He had problem in the region with all the Shi'i groups that he had put together. So it ended up giving him some benefit. But what happened later, the downing of the plane, again, with all the tragedy that it had, it gave some oxygen back to the public, so they revolted against. And I would like to say that I do not agree that, despite the fact that the much of the forces of U.S. are in the China Sea and the thing, but it's not for Trump or Americans to decide whether they want to stay in the Middle East or not. Middle East has become such a mess as a result of policies of Americans. Now we have got 18 years, close to two decades of war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, 9 years of mess in Libya and Syria. These are all direct products of U.S. foreign policy. So, and Iranian regime is not going to go away, despite all the problems that it has internally with its people, and also taking advantage of this mess in the region. He decided to maintain to all these Shi'i groups. And then these Shi'i groups, as I mentioned somewhere else, became catch-22 of the regime. In order to protect itself, it had to maintain all of these and nourish all of these. But at the same time, maintaining to these created problem for them because it put them at the collision course with the Americans and their allies. So I think they will expand their operation in the Middle East. Middle East is in more turmoil, and it's not going. The problems are not going away in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, everywhere else.
Janice, I'm curious as to your reaction too, because for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Soleimani was taken out. The Iranians responded. They responded by bombing American bases in Iraq, but took care not to kill anybody. What do you infer from that?
So it's not clear that that's correct.
Okay.
That's what U.S. commentators said originally. This was a missile attack. What really happened was the U.S. knew it was coming, was on high alert, was monitoring launch, and understood exactly how much warning time they had. These troops were able to go into hardened cover, right, which minimizes the missile attack, and so nobody was killed. And from everything we understand now, 8 were lifted out of the region because of concussion symptoms. But this was not a phony attack by the Iranians, nor was an attempt to signal to the United States We don't want. We're not going to exact.
Because the conventional wisdom was, we got to respond.
Yes.
But we don't want to inflame things more.
That's a different issue than not deciding beforehand that you weren't going to kill anybody, that it was phony. There were these two quite quick rounds of missile attacks. And then it was really extraordinary, where the foreign minister of Iran comes out and makes a statement, if you don't respond, we're not going to respond. I can't think of Christian and I work in this field. I can't think of another example in military history where there's an attack and one of the leaders comes out and says, okay, this is it, don't respond, we won't respond. It's unprecedented. So there's clearly, and I think this is an important part of the story going forward, there's a fear of escalation in Tehran. And there's a fear of escalation in Washington. Yes, this is going to play out, but it's going to play out at a lower level of violence than many people who are truly alarmed are thinking.
Is that to say, Christian, that both sides understand that something had to be done, but let's be super careful this just doesn't get out of hand here?
The Americans just days before had attacked 5 different command and control sites by Iranian militia in Iraq and had taken out arguably the second most powerful man in Iran, who you can compare to sort of in one office as sort of the equivalent of vice president, director of the CIA, and joint chiefs of staff. And in return, we get 12.5 missiles on 2 sites, about half a dozen of which actually missed their targets. This doesn't sound like very serious retribution to me. This looks like essentially, I think, a domestic, this was primarily in Iran for domestic consumption at home. And then, of course, the Iranians, as Janice pointed out, through 3 different channels on the same day, reiterated to the Americans that that was it. And so I think the Trump administration understood that the Iranians were very unlikely to escalate in the conditions that they currently find themselves in. And the Iranians, the astute politicians that they always are, also understood that the Trump administration is going to be unlikely to escalate. So I think this was signaling about actually trying to see whether they can achieve some sort of a grand bargain in the region by 2 parties that aren't sitting at the table and actually negotiating directly with one another.
Can I get you to follow up on that in as much as Donald Trump crows about everything? And he didn't crow about the fact that Iran responded and didn't kill anybody. He really played low key on that for him. What did you infer from that?
I can't help but wonder how people are holding him back, right? You know, from both his phone and from appearances. In fact, we were sort of going on live, Janice and I, and we were expecting him to come talk to the nation. If you remember, it was in the evening, and it was canceled. And we all said, oh, phew, right? Because indeed, I mean, once he sort of stands up there, he tends to put his foot in his mouth. So that was a good thing, certainly. If I just might add a few things here. These are Iraqi bases. I mean, this is really interesting, talking about the messaging and the narrative. These were Iraqi bases where American soldiers are guests. And it's interesting because the Iranians took the message that they hit American bases, and a lot of us picked that up in the media, to be honest with you, because it's a shorthand, but they're actually Iraqi bases. There's no U.S. military bases in Iraq. That's important. The other thing, too, is that the Iranians made a big deal out of, in fact, there's a lot of false news and fake news, perhaps, that they actually did kill Americans. They keep arguing that, in fact, they killed 80 American soldiers in that base. Now, of course, we also saw a very long, prolonged coming out with the fact that you had, 8 to 11 soldiers that were injured there. That came out a little bit later. So it's interesting to wonder how much truth there is in all of this. There's certainly spin on both sides. Everybody's trying to claim a victory, but that's what's so scary about this situation. You know, we're talking about very short distance between Iran and Iraq, so the response time is super, super short, and there's a lot of room for error. And when you have, frankly, irrational leaders, I mean, you know, we like to talk about them as sort of rational people, but increasingly you can see just the emotive, response over the death of Soleimani. That was emotional. That was not just rational. So there is, I think, a lot of people in those quarters who I feared having, different, abilities to counteract potential moves there. I don't think it could, it ended out, I think, in the end, thankfully, okay, in the sense that we both saw parties returning to this deterrence of a grand bargain, but it could have gone wrong very quickly.
Just one quick comment, and Said and I were talking about this earlier. I don't actually think Soleimani is the second most powerful man in the regime at all. I think he is a very divisive figure internally. He had a personal relationship with the supreme leader. which was actually a source of worry and concern. He was the leader of what's called the Republican Guards, the Quds Force, which is its external expeditionary force. The regular commander of the IRGC saw Soleimani as a real threat. Let's talk about the military who saw him as a real threat. There are deep divisions within Iran. We talk about Iran as a unitary actor. It's not. And there are many, many senior leaders who, while of course condemning what is an illegal assassination and an affront to their sovereignty, are secretly very happy that this man who had this special access reported to nobody but the supreme leader is now out of the picture domestically.
Let me get Saeed to follow up on that, in as much as, Janice is right, we often hear commentators say Iran as if it's a single entity making decisions. Can you help us understand the different power complexes in that country?
Before getting to that, I would like to also go back to the earlier discussion, I see it a bit differently because the Iranian regime, after killing of Soleimani was assassinated, was killed, they had to come up with some sort of face-saving response because they would not survive, without doing this. So what they did, they knew that they did not want to get into a major war because they are no match for U.S. and their allies. And they knew that Americans do not want to have a war, It's not that just Trump. Don't forget that. They can, even Trump knows that Iranian regime is not like Gaddafi in Libya or Saddam Hussein. It's a well-established system, that they knew that if that war took 18 years, still they are there, what will happen to a war with Iran? So they knew that they don't want the war. So for face-saving mechanism, what they did, they contacted Iraqis, and now it is out, And Iraqis told Americans that they are going to send some missiles to some of these, it's true that these are not American bases, but Americans are in 15 bases in Iraq. So whether we call it American bases or not, but they are there. So it was a face-saving things, and it worked. They knew that it's not going to be responded. But in terms of the differences, Iranian regime is, in the process, is a very complex oligarchy. At first, it was clerical oligarchy. During the war with Iraq, it became clerical military oligarchy. After the war, with all the policies of Rafsanjani and others, and they distributed the whole government, whatever they had confiscated during the revolution, among themselves. So they became clerical military business oligarchy.
So when you say after the war, you mean the Iran-Iraq war?
Of the Iran-Iraq war,
okay.
Yes.
8
years
long.
of war, yes. Yeah. After that, so Rafsanjani followed a new liberal policy. So they, in a sense, a new class of people, capitalists, were created out of families of mullahs, clerics, and also generals and the things. So this oligarchy was ruling Iran and is ruling Iran. But at the same time, supreme leader is becoming a trouble not only for the people, but supreme leader, through its centralization, is creating a sort of dictatorial one-man rule. And many of those guys in power are getting worried that his policies, his obscurantist view of the world, may really create problem for even them, forget about Iranian people.
In which case, Christian, the current president of the United States, fancies himself a deal maker. If you want to make a deal with Iran, who do you make it with?
First, I think you have to find a way to get Iran back to the table. If you want to get a different deal or a better deal with Iran, first you're going to have to talk to Iran. And so what's the mechanism to bring Iran back to the table? Well, this agreement includes a conflict resolution mechanism that has now been invoked by the Europeans that allows the Iranians, and I think the Middle East, having lived in the Middle East, I would say it's all about saving face. You're absolutely right in these circumstances. So this is a way for the Iranians to return to the table, but being able to say to their people that we never wanted to be at this table, we never actually wanted to, we never actually wanted to negotiate. And to try to get a different sort of deal and a different sort of outcome for the region.
You see, the tough part of this is that the moderates made that first deal. with the Obama administration. The president and the foreign minister, President Rouhani and the foreign minister, they invested every bit of political capital that they had in that deal, and they paid a domestic price. And the expectation was sanctions were going to be lifted and this crippling strangulation of the Iranian economy would end. Trump walked away from it. There's no other way to describe it. With no violation of the agreement, he unilaterally broke the word of the United States and walked away. The domestic political consequences for the moderates is terrible. They're weakened. So in this Trump deal-making scenario, I ask myself, who is coming to the table? Is it going to be the Revolutionary Guards who are going to authorize this? No, for all the oligarchical reasons that you just, they benefit from the status quo. Trump has made it much, as usual, he's made it much harder for people to come to the table and actually negotiate.
But let's understand why he walked away, right? There's still a concern that Iran is one day sooner rather than later going to acquire intercontinental ballistic missiles, and one day sooner rather than later will have the capability to build weapons of mass destruction. And those missiles will eventually be able to hit the east coast of the United States, which then essentially makes US and also Canadian foreign policy subject to extortion and containment by Iran. And I think Trump is determined not to let that happen.
There is an investigation right now, obviously, into the downing of the Ukrainian plane. It's ongoing. Do we have any sense, Besma, of where it's at right now?
It's stuck in limbo. And even just the very simple, what tended to be very pro forma of the black box is now a subject of dispute. The Iranians suggested that they can't actually even decode the black box. So initially, it was supposed to go to Ukraine. Ukraine was supposed to decode it. Then the Iranians said no. And now they're saying, actually, we don't know how to do it. Can you decode it? So just the simplest of things is not being allowed. Of course, Canada has TSB. This is, Transport Safety Board people there. And we have investigators on the ground, which is fantastic. But, I think it goes back to the challenge we've seen in the media with Trudeau, for example, in the past week about sort of like where did this begin? Where's patient zero in this long line of issues, right? Was it the context that Donald Trump created of this entire assassination is to blame? Right? Was it the incompetence of the Iranian regime, which obviously is an enormous part, in my humble opinion, of this all, because at the end of the day, they should not have allowed civilian airplanes in the airspace if they were going to carry out this kind of attack. And so this really falls back on their doorstep, but doesn't matter. In terms of the world of public opinion, let's not forget here, this was tied to the assassination of Soleimani in many ways. So all of this, frankly, is about a chicken and egg argument that I think at the end of the day, we're not going to get to a conclusion just because of the reality that there's so many finger pointing going on.
Well, here's another reality, Christian. We don't have diplomatic relations with Iran right now. So what can we do, or what leverage do we have in order to get A, compensation for the victims of this plane shooting, and B, ensuring a proper investigation?
Well, the military always says intelligence always pays off. And I think in this case, we saw it early on. The Prime Minister came out unequivocally that both our own intelligence and our allied intelligence clearly corroborated that this was that plane was shot down. So he gave Iran an opportunity to change their tune. And Iran did change their tune, because the option is what Russia endured after the MH17 shoot down, so the Malaysian airliner over Ukraine. So I think the Iranian regime sort of picked sort of the better of all the bad choices that it had, faced with this dilemma about which route to pursue. And I think so Canada has a number of options at its disposal. The MH17 investigation has showed that with good intelligence and some really good physicists, you can actually reconstruct very precisely what happened. This particular anti-aircraft battery, the SA-15, is only operated by the Republican Guard. There's only 29 of them, so we can reconstruct with intelligence who the people are within that chain of command, and we can then pursue justice. We can attempt to pursue justice under our own domestic legislation, but we can also follow the MH17 precedent and try to pursue justice at the International Court. This case has not yet been heard, but I think it will set an interesting precedent for how we deal with airplanes that get shot down over airspace due to unintentional or military intent or whatnot. And so I think, this is unfortunately not going to be the last situation.
Let me get
like
this right on this. Go ahead.
The Iranian regime knows that there will be lots of lawsuits, And then particularly, not only for shooting these, but also the point that you mentioned, I'm not expert in aviation, but it seems that there is a Chicago Convention that if that there are some military involvement in the area, it's the responsibility of the government to notify everybody. So they haven't done that. So they are in deep trouble for that. But what Canada can do, of course, Iranians will try as much as they can not to provide any evidence for the lawsuits and the things. But I think Canada's options are very, very limited. But at the same time, Iranian regime would like to regain its diplomatic relationship with Canada.
Well, let me ask you about that. And I want to ask you this question because you're originally from Iran, but you've lived in Canada for a very long time. Were you in favor of Stephen Harper's government breaking off diplomatic ties with Iran when it did?
Well, I don't agree with anything Harper about he did, but at the same time, on this, there were reasons, because of Zara Kazemi and others who were killed and was not doing it. I cannot really, because there are plus and minuses on this.
I understand.
But for now, I can comment on this, that I understand that the Iranian regime wants to maintain, because not only there are lots of Iranians here, but there are many of their own close relatives and people are here. Don't forget that many of those people who have stolen money have come to Canada. Canada, tragically, has become a sort of joke in social media and also in Iranian cinema, that anybody who disappears, they say that he has gone to Canada,
Money laundering.
But the question becomes, is it now more difficult, as we try to get compensation for our victims, we don't have diplomatic Go ahead. Not more difficult without relations?
Well, no, what they are doing, though, is suggesting that because they don't recognize dual nationality, they are going to pay them as though they were Iranian. And that's to set on their own terms. That's the biggest challenge, is that of 176, many of them actually were born in Iran, and so they're not recognizing dual citizenship. They're not going to pay them for what Canada is requiring vis-a-vis international law.
I think that's
they're going to settle it in domestic courts. So that's part of the bigger challenge. Just not having a diplomatic relationship that's going to make a difference. We can be just as effective through these back channels. I don't think there's any need to, frankly, and I know it's not a reward, but it will be seen as a reward at this particular time if we're to reopen the embassy. I was totally against Harper closing it, but this is not the time to signal to the Iran that we're okay with what they did.
If we had diplomatic relations, Steve, the Iranian government would say 3 Canadians were on that flight. Because all but, of the 57, all but 54 were dual nationals, and the Iranian government does not recognize dual nationals, right? So we would still be a minority shareholder in the investigation of the airliner because other countries had more. So I think that we can have a debate about diplomatic relations, but that's not germane to what the government needs to get done.
Okay.
Let's add one more issue. Iranian compensation to families is an order of magnitude different from what Canadian compensation will be. That's all going to be fought out in the courts over the next several years. It's going to take years.
In our last few minutes, this incident has raised some questions about NATO, its current mission, whether it ought to be enlarged, whether, as President Donald Trump says, we should turn it into NATO and me.
NATO me.
NATO me.
NATO
NATO
me. Me meaning Middle East.
Yes.
Saeed, what do you think?
Well, I think this is the problem, that NATO, we should not forget that what Emmanuel Macron said is brain dead, I mean, it was created to fight against Soviet Union. When Soviet Union died, NATO should have died, but they maintain it because of its benefits. Anyways, I think because of the same reason that I mentioned, Middle East will continue to be a source of problem, and that is why Trump is serious in this case to drag NATO into the Middle East. We should hope that Canada would stay away from it. You should not forget how it was dragged into Afghanistan, how it was dragged into bombardment of Libya and Syria, all of these things. Canada was a superpower when it came to peacekeeping and human rights. Unfortunately, by getting involved into military activities, I think it damaged its reputation.
Christian, I got 20 seconds left to ask you. NATO me. North Atlantic Treaty Organization with some Middle Eastern content. You like or you don't like?
NATO is Canada's single most important multilateral institution in terms of asserting our interests around the world.
But fighting against whom?
One of the things we learn in the Middle East is we don't want to leave international regional security up to the United States. And NATO is a way of containing the United States and having at least some leverage over US decision making. And the reason why we find ourselves in the United States is in the Middle East repeatedly is precisely because we've left too much up to the Americans to decide on their own.
But has this happened anywhere? I mean, it's all
the
Americans who drag
destabilizing
the rest
effects.
into
Forgive
the
me,
war.
gang. The moderator's got to jump in. We got to get you guys back for a NATO Me show. That's what this is. Okay, Janice Stein, Christian Leuprecht on one side of the table, Besma Momani, Saeed Ranama on the other side of the table. Thanks a lot for your helping us understand this part of the world a lot better tonight. Appreciate it.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.